The Vietnam War was one of the most difficult and costly conflicts the United States ever faced. Despite advanced weapons, air power, and training, U.S. forces struggled for years against an enemy that seemed invisible, unpredictable, and unstoppable. Who were these fighters? How did they manage to outsmart a superpower? The answer lies deep in the jungles, tunnels, and villages of Vietnam. Join us as we talk about why the Viet Cong were so much better at warfare. The beginning of a new war. To understand why the Viet Cong were so much better at warfare, let's go back to the time when Vietnam was divided. In 1954, after almost a century of colonial rule, the French were forced to leave Vietnam. They had controlled large parts of the country since the 1800s, turning Vietnam into a colony they used for profit. But during World War II, the Japanese took over, and after the war ended, many Vietnamese no longer accepted the return of French control. A man named Ho Chi Minh, who had spent years traveling and studying abroad, believed that Vietnam should be free, united, and independent under a communist system. He and his fighters, called the Viet Minh, launched a powerful resistance against the French. After years of fighting, the turning point came at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The French believed they had set a strong military trap in the northwest hills of Vietnam, confident they could defeat the Viet Minh from a heavily fortified base. But the Viet Minh surprised them. They dragged heavy weapons up mountains by hand, dug complex trench systems, and surrounded the French. After nearly 2 months of siege, the French surrendered. It was a humiliating loss, and it signaled the end of France's war in Vietnam. Soon after, world powers met in Geneva, Switzerland, to decide what would happen next. In the Geneva Accords of 1954, it was agreed that Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Communists. The South would be governed by an anti-communist leader, backed by the United States and its allies. The plan was to hold elections later that would reunite the country under one government, but those elections never happened. The United States quickly stepped in. American leaders were afraid that if Vietnam became fully communist, other countries in Asia would follow. This fear was known as the domino theory. President Eisenhower and his administration believed that if one country fell to communism, others would fall too, one after the other, like a row of dominoes. To stop this from happening, the U.S. began sending money, weapons, and military advisors to help build up the South Vietnamese government and army. At first, American involvement was small, but the U.S. government was determined not to lose another country to communism, especially after what had happened in China in 1949. So over time, the number of American advisors increased, and the U.S. became more deeply involved in the South's politics and military planning. The South Vietnamese government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, was supposed to represent democracy, but many people in the South felt that Diem's rule was harsh and unfair. He cracked down on political opponents, favored his own family and religious group, and ignored the needs of many rural people. Meanwhile, in the countryside, something was growing quietly, something that would become one of the greatest challenges the United States and South Vietnam would ever face. Former Viet Minh fighters who had stayed behind in the South began organizing in secret. They believed that the South's government was corrupt and unworthy of leading the country. These fighters and their supporters wanted to reunite Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's leadership and bring communism to the whole nation. They began forming underground networks, building support among poor farmers, and carrying out political attacks. In time, they would be known as the Viet Cong, the rise of the Viet Cong. At first, they were small in number and loosely organized, but as the months passed, they grew stronger and more dangerous. These fighters, known as the Viet Cong, were not professional soldiers in the traditional sense. Many of them were ordinary people, rice farmers, fishermen, laborers, who worked during the day and picked up weapons at night. To someone passing through a village, they might have looked like any other neighbor or worker. But when darkness fell, they became part of a hidden war. They sabotaged roads, gathered intelligence, and launched deadly ambushes. They didn't need a base or a barracks. The jungle, the mountains, and the villages were their shelter. Their power didn't come only from secrecy. it also came from support, especially from the north. Ho Chi Minh and his government in North Vietnam saw the Viet Cong as a crucial part of their goal, uniting the country under communist rule. So they began to train them, equip them, and send them supplies. This support changed everything. The Viet Cong were no longer just scattered local fighters. With the help of the North Vietnamese Army, also known as the PAVN, they became more coordinated, more skilled, and far better armed than before. Weapons, food, and even medical supplies traveled along a complex network of paths, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail stretched through the thick jungles of neighboring Laos and Cambodia, and connected the north to the southern battlefields. It was hard to detect from the air, and even harder to destroy. The US would later drop millions of bombs trying to stop it, but the supplies kept moving. No matter how many attacks the Americans launched, the Viet Cong always seemed to recover and strike again. One reason they were so hard to stop was that they understood the land better than anyone. Many were born and raised in the same countryside where they fought. They knew which paths were dry in the rainy season, which fields could hide weapons, and which villagers could be trusted. In many rural areas, the line between civilian and soldier became almost invisible. Families might cook for them, hide them, or pass along secret messages. Others might be too afraid to resist. The Viet Cong used this closeness to the people as both a shield and a sword. They also knew how to disappear. After an attack, they didn't wait around for a counterstrike. They vanished into thick jungle, slipped into underground tunnels, or simply changed clothes and blended in with the crowd. US and South Vietnamese forces were trained to fight a visible enemy, a line of troops, a marked base, or a clear target. But the Viet Cong didn't play by those rules. They weren't an army you could easily find, or fight. As you'll see soon, that was one of the main reasons they became so hard to defeat. Guerrilla tactics. The Viet Cong didn't fight like regular soldiers. They didn't wear clear uniforms, march in formation, or set up large army bases. Instead, they used a completely different style of warfare, one that confused, frustrated, and exhausted the American and South Vietnamese troops who tried to stop them. This way of fighting is called guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is about moving quickly, striking unexpectedly, and avoiding direct battles. The Viet Cong used ambushes to surprise enemy patrols. They would wait, often for hours, hidden deep in the jungle or along narrow trails, until a unit of South Vietnamese or American soldiers walked by. Then, in a flash, the Viet Cong would attack with rifles, grenades, or explosives, and disappear just as fast. One of the most dangerous parts of these attacks was the use of booby traps. These were homemade explosives, hidden pits with sharp spikes, or tripwires connected to grenades. Sometimes the traps were disguised as harmless everyday objects, like a tin can or a piece of clothing. Soldiers had to be extremely careful with every step they took. Even if there was no battle happening, the jungle itself could be deadly. In fact, booby traps caused about 11% of all US combat deaths in Vietnam, without a single shot being fired. Underground, the Viet Cong built something even more surprising, a massive network of tunnels. These tunnels stretched for miles under the ground. Some were just large enough to crawl through, while others had rooms for resting, cooking, treating the wounded, and storing supplies. There were even places for planning attacks. The tunnel entrances were usually hidden, covered with leaves, behind trees, or beneath huts. This meant that even if American troops cleared a village or an area of jungle, the Viet Cong could still be just a few feet away, watching and waiting. But what made the Viet Cong even more difficult to fight was their ability to blend in with civilians. In many villages, you couldn't tell who was a fighter and who wasn't. A person working in the rice field during the day might be setting traps at night. A teenager selling vegetables in the market might also be carrying messages or grenades. For US soldiers, this made things incredibly stressful. Every person they met could be a threat or an innocent bystander. This often led to confusion, fear, and tragic mistakes. In the countryside, the Viet Cong used both fear and loyalty to control the people. In areas where they were strong, they punished anyone who helped the South Vietnamese government or the Americans. At night, they might sneak into a village, hold a meeting, and then execute a local official or schoolteacher accused of working with the enemy. But they didn't rule only with terror. They also gave help to poor villagers, shared supplies, and promised a future free from foreign control. This mix of threats and promises gave them power over many rural communities. By using these tactics, the Viet Cong turned the war into something the Americans were not ready for. Just think about it. Can you fight an enemy you can't even see? That's the question American commanders kept asking themselves. And as the war went on, they found that the answer wasn't simple. A surprise that shook the world. Fast forward to 1968. After years of brutal jungle fighting, endless casualties, and rising tension, many people in the United States believed the war in Vietnam was starting to turn in their favor. Reports from American commanders spoke of progress. Television and newspapers said the enemy was weakening. At home, leaders promised that victory was just around the corner. Then came the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in the country. In past years, both sides had often paused fighting during this time as an informal truce. In early 1968, the same kind of ceasefire was expected. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces let down their guard. Cities were quiet. Troops were relaxed. Even many American families watching the news from home believed things might soon be over. But the Viet Cong had a completely different plan. In the early hours of January 30th, 1968, during what was supposed to be a peaceful holiday, the Viet Cong launched one of the most surprising attacks in modern warfare. Along with North Vietnamese troops, they struck more than 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam, all at once. Their targets included key locations like Da Nang, Hue, and even the capital, Saigon. In Saigon, they attacked the presidential palace and stormed the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. The suddenness of the assault shocked everyone. Even though the attackers were eventually pushed back and the offensive did not lead to any long-term military gains, the damage had already been done, not just on the battlefield, but in people's minds. American citizens watching from their living rooms saw the chaos unfold live on television. They saw U.S. bases under attack. They saw the streets of Saigon filled with smoke, gunfire, and confusion. Many people began to ask a difficult question. If the enemy was so weak, how were they able to attack everywhere all at once? The U.S. military won the battle by pushing back the offensive. But in another way, the Viet Cong had achieved something even more powerful. They had sent a message to the world. The war was far from over. The enemy was still strong, still coordinated, and still ready to fight. Public opinion in the United States began to shift rapidly. Protests against the war grew louder. Confidence in the government's strategy started to collapse. For many Americans, Tet marked a turning point in how they viewed their leaders, the military, and the reasons for fighting in Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson, under growing pressure, announced just 2 months later that he would not seek re-election. In the years that followed, the U.S. began to rethink its entire strategy. Under the new president, Richard Nixon, a policy called Vietnamization was introduced. The idea was simple on paper. The South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, would be trained and equipped to take over the fighting, while American troops gradually pulled out. At first, Vietnamization looked promising. American ground troops were withdrawn from major combat zones and repositioned to safer coastal areas. The number of U.S. casualties dropped. By 1970, the ARVN had taken on more responsibility, and local militias were providing better security in rural areas. But there were cracks in the plan. As U.S. involvement decreased, problems inside the American military grew worse. Morale among U.S. troops collapsed. Many soldiers felt like they were fighting a war that no one at home supported. Others simply didn't want to be there anymore. Drug use rose sharply. By some estimates, about 30% of American soldiers were using marijuana regularly, and up to 10% were addicted to heroin. There were also increasing cases of soldiers refusing to fight or follow orders. In the most extreme cases, some soldiers even attacked their own officers, a disturbing phenomenon known as fragging. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong adapted once again. After suffering losses in Tet, they returned to what they knew best: small, targeted attacks in rural areas. They moved in smaller units, carried out nighttime ambushes, and continued to operate in areas where they had local support. While the Americans and South Vietnamese focused on larger battles and territorial control, the Viet Cong used time as their greatest weapon. They didn't need to win every battle. They just needed to keep fighting long enough for the other side to grow tired. Why were the Viet Cong so hard to defeat? It is probably clear to you by now why the Viet Cong were just so much better at warfare. But to fully understand why they were so hard to defeat, we need to look at what they had and how they used it. First, they had a cause. The Viet Cong believed they were fighting for something bigger than just politics. For many of them, this was a war to free Vietnam from foreign control and to reunite the country. After centuries of colonization, first by China, then France, and now with America supporting the South, the fighters in the North and their allies in the South saw themselves as nationalists. They believed it was their duty to bring Vietnam together under one government, one flag, and one future. That belief gave them strength and purpose, even when times were hard. Unlike many U.S. troops, who were drafted and didn't always know why they were there, Viet Cong fighters knew exactly what they were fighting for. Second, they had the people. In rural areas of South Vietnam, many villagers supported the Viet Cong, or at least cooperated out of fear. Some believed in their cause, others had no choice. In either case, the result was the same. Food, shelter, and information flowed to the Viet Cong from local communities. The U.S. and South Vietnamese governments tried to win hearts and minds, but in many places they were seen as outsiders. The Viet Cong, often born in the same villages, spoke the same dialects and knew the customs. In a war where knowing who was who mattered more than uniforms, this made a huge difference. Third, they had the land. Vietnam's thick jungles, rice paddies, and twisting trails gave the Viet Cong a natural advantage. They built tunnels underground, entire networks where fighters could hide, sleep, and plan attacks. Some tunnels had kitchens, hospitals, and even schools. Above ground, they knew every trail, every river bend, and every hidden path. For American soldiers unfamiliar with the terrain, moving through the jungle felt like walking into a trap, and often it was. The land didn't just belong to the Viet Cong, it protected them. Fourth, they had time. The Viet Cong knew they didn't need to defeat the Americans in a quick major battle. They only needed to hold on. Time was on their side. They believed that if they kept fighting, eventually the Americans would grow tired, the South Vietnamese government would weaken, and the war would turn in their favor. In a sense, their patience was one of their most powerful weapons. Fifth, they had help. While the Viet Cong fought mostly in the South, they were heavily supported by the North. North Vietnam provided training, supplies, and leadership. But it didn't stop there. China and the Soviet Union also gave money, weapons, and advisors. These supplies moved through hidden trails across borders, especially the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and reached fighters deep inside South Vietnam. Even though the U.S. had more advanced weapons and more troops, the Viet Cong had a steady supply line that kept them in the fight year after year. Sixth, they adapted constantly. At the beginning, they were mostly farmers with rifles, using basic hit-and-run tactics. But over time, they changed. They built traps, used propaganda, learned how to hide from helicopters, and even became skilled at fighting in cities. They recruited women and children as spies, couriers, and lookouts. They never stayed the same for long. Whenever the U.S. developed a new tactic, the Viet Cong found a way around it. This combination of belief, people, land, time, support, and constant adaptation made the Viet Cong one of the most difficult enemies the United States had ever faced. The fall of Saigon and the legacy. By 1975, the long and brutal war in Vietnam was reaching its final moments. The United States had already pulled out its combat troops, and South Vietnam was left to fight on its own. But the North Vietnamese forces, now stronger and more experienced than ever, were ready for one last push. The Viet Cong, although fewer in number than before, still played a role in gathering intelligence and weakening enemy positions from within. In March 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive. Their army, known as the People's Army of Vietnam or PAVN, moved quickly through the Central Highlands, capturing cities with surprising speed. South Vietnamese troops began retreating in confusion. Town after town fell. There were few places left to hide. The final target was Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. South Vietnamese soldiers surrendered. President Duong Van Minh, who had only taken office 2 days earlier, gave up without a fight. American helicopters took off from rooftops, carrying out one of the largest emergency evacuations in history. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians tried desperately to escape. Some made it onto the helicopters. Many did not. The war was over. With the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was officially united under communist rule. The country was renamed the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. For the people of the North, this was a long-awaited victory. For many in the South, it meant fear, confusion, and huge changes to daily life. Some were sent to re-education camps. Others tried to flee the country by boat, hoping to reach safety elsewhere. The war might have ended, but its impact was far from over. As for the Viet Cong, their mission was complete. They had helped defeat one of the most powerful armies in the world, but they would not continue as a separate force. After reunification, the Viet Cong, officially known as the National Liberation Front, was dissolved. The North Vietnamese government took full control of the new, united Vietnam. Even though the Viet Cong no longer existed, their strategies continued to live on. Military leaders around the world studied their tactics, especially their use of guerrilla warfare. They had shown how a smaller, less equipped force could challenge a stronger enemy using surprise, local knowledge, and political support. Many future conflicts, including those in the Middle East and Latin America, were shaped by lessons from Vietnam. But the war also left behind deep scars. An estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese were killed, along with over 58,000 American soldiers. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or left dealing with the mental toll of years of violence. The land itself suffered too. Forests were destroyed by chemicals like Agent Orange. Bombs and landmines remained hidden in the ground for decades. In the United States, the war sparked huge political and social changes. It was the first war Americans watched on television, often seeing graphic images that shocked and upset the public. Trust in government declined as people learned more about how the war was managed and how much had been kept secret. The country struggled to understand how a war with so much power behind it could end in failure. Even today, historians, veterans, and leaders still debate the meaning of the Vietnam War. Was it a necessary fight against communism or a costly mistake? Could it have ended differently? What do you think? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more.